Mountain man told obese girl, "You'll sleep in my bed tonight." But what he really meant was, "Leave her. The fat one will slow us all down." The words snapped like a branch in the dark, and then they were gone. The men, the lantern, the last thread of safety, leaving Sophia Whitmore alone with the breath of the forest and the cold that crept like a patient animal. Hours earlier, the stage had rattled under autumn stars, wheels singing on frozen ruts. Then the road bent, the shadows moved, and rifles glinted where trees should have been. The bandits took everything with bored efficiency. Purses, rings, letters, even the ribbon at Sophie's throat. When it was done, they laughed as if the night owed them applause. The driver pointed south and barked at the passengers to walk if they valued their lives. They did. Sophie tried. But fear has long legs, and kindness often doesn't. By the third hill, they were silhouettes. By the fourth, they were nothing at all. Now the forest pressed close. Pines pitched like black spears, wind stitching through the needles, owls calling in questions. Sophie hugged herself and kept moving. Each step sank into damp leaves and old needles. Her breaths came ragged, tearing at the place in her chest where humiliation lived. She'd written carefully to a stranger for months, Mr. Ellison of Clearwater, promising steady hands, gentle company, a tidy home. She hadn't promised beauty. She never knew how to promise what she'd never been given. The cold deepened. With it came the old chorus from the town she'd passed through. Too much, too soft, too slow. She set her teeth and counted the trees she passed as if numbers might steady the dark. 10, 20, 30. But numbers don't warm fingers. Her feet went numb. The night learned her name. At last she stumbled against a fallen fir and folded down beside it, pulling her skirt around her like a poor excuse for a blanket. Needles pricked her palms. The smell of sap and frost filled her nose. Somewhere far off, water ran, bright and indifferent. "Please," she whispered to no one, to everyone, "I don't want to die here." She thought of her mother's sewing basket, of cinnamon rolls that never rose high enough, of the careful script on the letters she'd mailed west. She thought of the way men watched her with a measuring eye, like a shopkeeper tallying weight. Light moved between the trees. Not moonlight. A lantern, steady and deliberate, floating toward her on boots that hardly seemed to touch the earth. It resolved into a man first by size, then by presence, a silhouette as broad as a door, shoulders fur-lined, a long coat slick with dew. When he came close enough for the lantern to find his face, she saw the beard, the weather-bitten skin, and eyes like glacier water. He knelt without ceremony, palm landing warm against her forehead. "You're burning and freezing at once," he said, voice low as the ground itself. "All right, I've got you." He shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her, lifting her as if she weighed nothing more than a bundle of winter wheat. The forest opened ahead in a ribbon of faint trail. The lantern bobbed, marking the promise of somewhere that wasn't this. "Where in the world are you listening from tonight?" he murmured to the emptiness, or perhaps to the stars, before glancing down at her again. "Name's Marcus Ironwood. You're safe now." When Sophia Whitmore awoke, she thought she had died and gone to some quiet purgatory of warmth and wood smoke. The air smelled of pine resin, iron kettles, and something cooking slow over a flame. She blinked against the light, orange, soft, alive, and realized she was lying under a wool blanket thick enough to smother the world's cold. Her body ached as though she'd wrestled the storm itself. The fabric against her skin felt unfamiliar. She looked down and saw that she wore a shirt too large for her, a man's flannel, sleeves rolled at the wrists, hem brushing her knees. Her heart jumped. Before she could panic, a low voice spoke from across the room. "Easy now. You're safe." She turned sharply. The man from the forest sat near the fire, boots planted, a tin cup steaming in his hands. He looked every bit the legend she half remembered from tavern whispers. The ironwood hermit, the mountain ghost, the man who'd built his cabin where wolves wouldn't dare sleep. He was massive, nearly twice her size, with dark hair pulled back and a beard shot through with gray. His eyes, when they met hers, were the color of a thawing lake, cold by nature, warm by choice. "Where am I?" she asked, clutching the blanket tighter. "My cabin, north ridge of the Bitterroots. You were half dead when I found you." He set his cup down and nodded toward her. "You'd have frozen solid if I hadn't pulled you out." Sophie swallowed, the memory returning in flashes. The bandits, the dark, the cold that had crept beneath her bones. You saved me." "Did what needed doing." Her gaze dropped to the shirt she wore. "And my clothes?" "By the fire," he said simply, gesturing to the line of damp fabric hanging above the hearth. "Soaked through. I changed you into something dry." He must have seen the alarm flicker across her face because his tone softened. "Didn't look where I shouldn't. I swear it on my mother's grave." Sophie hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Thank you. I didn't mean to sound ungrateful." His mouth twitched, almost a smile. "You sound alive. That's good enough." Silence filled the room, broken only by the hiss of the fire and the sigh of wind against the shutters. Sophie studied the cabin. It was tidy, almost austere. Tools hung in careful order, shelves of canned fruit and beans, a single narrow bed tucked in the corner. Everything about it spoke of a man who built with purpose and lived with restraint. Marcus rose, his movements heavy but graceful, and ladled stew into a bowl. He crossed the room, offering it to her. "Eat. You need strength more than talk." She accepted, fingers brushing his for a heartbeat. The broth was simple, venison, potatoes, a hint of sage, but to her it tasted like mercy. He returned to his chair, watching the fire. "How long were you wandering out there?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Hours, maybe. I was traveling by coach from Helena to Clearwater. The men who robbed us, they took everything, and when I fell behind, the others left me." Her voice faltered. "They said I'd slow them down." Marcus's jaw worked, the muscles shifting like stone under strain. "Cowards! The woods aren't kind to those who walk alone." "I didn't have a choice." He looked at her then, really looked, not the way others had, weighing or mocking, but as if she were something human worth understanding. "You've got more grit than they do," he said quietly. "You're still breathing." Her throat tightened. "Barely." "That's enough," he replied. "Barely's how most people start again." The words sank deep. No one had ever spoken to her like that, with plain conviction instead of pity. She set the empty bowl aside, feeling the warmth creep back into her hands and maybe her heart. Marcus rose, checked the window, and frowned at the curtain of white still falling outside. "Storm set in again. You won't be going anywhere for a few days." Sophie nodded, unsure whether relief or fear stirred inside her. He hesitated, scratching at his beard. "There's only one bed. You'll take it. I'll sleep out here by the fire." Her head snapped up. "The bed? "No, I can't." "You can and you will," he said, his tone leaving no space for argument. "You're not sleeping on the floor with that cold still in your bones." She opened her mouth to protest, but his gaze stopped her. There was no mockery there, no hunger, only a quiet insistence born of decency. "Rest," he said finally. "That's an order." Sophie sank back into the pillows, eyes stinging unexpectedly. It had been a long time since anyone had cared whether she froze or not. As Marcus settled by the hearth, the firelight carved his silhouette against the wall. Broad shoulders, bowed head, a man who had learned to carry both silence and storms. And somewhere between the crackle of wood and the whisper of snow, Sophie closed her eyes and realized she wasn't afraid anymore. The next morning broke pale and silver, the world outside washed clean under a new layer of snow. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, and the scent of coffee filled the air. Marcus Ironwood moved quietly, a presence as steady as the ticking of the clock on the shelf. Sophie stirred beneath the blanket, blinking toward the window. Frost laced the glass like spider webs. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was, until she saw the broad back of the man at the stove and the heavy coat hanging near the door. Then it all came rushing back. "You sleep light for someone near frozen last night," Marcus said without turning. His voice was low, rough from disuse, but not unkind. "I thought it was all a dream," she murmured. He poured coffee into a tin cup and set it by her. "No dream. You're still in the land of the living." Sophie smiled faintly, taking the cup in both hands. "Thanks to you." He shrugged, tugging on his gloves. "Storm's calmed some. I'll check the traps, maybe clear the path to the creek. You stay in here, keep the fire up." She frowned. "You shouldn't go alone." He shot her a look over his shoulder. "I've been alone 10 winters. I can manage one more morning." Something in the quiet certainty of his tone made her chest ache. "Then at least promise you'll come back." That earned a small smirk. "You planning to stop me?" She met his eyes and, for the first time, saw a glint of humor beneath the stoicism. "I might," she said softly. He chuckled, a low, brief sound that warmed the cold air, and left, shutting the door gently behind him. Hours later, Sophie busied herself with what she could. She swept, boiled water, and hung her damp clothes closer to the fire. But as the cabin settled into silence, loneliness crept in. She'd lived through many silences before, those of empty rooms, indifferent voices, and men who looked away. But this one was different. It wasn't cruel. It was waiting. By the time Marcus returned, snow clung to his shoulders and his hair glittered with frost. He carried 2 rabbits slung over his belt. "You kept the fire," he said approvingly. "Good." "I tried not to let it die." "Good instincts," he said, hanging the rabbits by the door. "Fire's half of surviving out here. The other half is stubbornness." "I suppose I have both," Sophie said quietly. He looked at her, really looked. "Aye," he agreed. "You do." That night, as snow whispered against the roof, Marcus taught her how to skin a rabbit. She winced at first, the small sounds of tearing making her stomach twist, but he guided her hands with steady patience. "Don't think about what it was," he said softly. "Think about what it gives. Out here, nothing survives unless it learns to take what the land offers." She nodded, forcing herself to look. "I'm not used to taking." "That's clear enough." She glanced up. "You think I'm weak?" He shook his head. "No, I think you've been told you are so often you started to believe it. The knife in her hand paused. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she whispered, "Maybe you're right." "I am," he said simply, and began to show her how to cut the meat into pieces for the stew. Later, when the pot simmered and steam fogged the windows, Sophie dared to ask, "Why do you live out here, alone?" Marcus stared into the fire for a long time before answering. "Peace," he said at last, "and punishment." "Punishment?" He nodded. "I lost people, a wife, 2 boys. I couldn't stand the sound of other voices after that, so I came here and let the silence keep me company." Sophie swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." He shrugged, but the muscles in his jaw worked. "Was a long time ago. Some scars just remember to ache when it snows." She wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled in her throat. So instead, she ladled stew into 2 bowls and set one before him. "Then maybe tonight the silence can share a meal instead." That made him look up. For a heartbeat, she thought he might refuse, but then he nodded once, quietly. Fair bargain. The days that followed fell into rhythm. Each morning, Marcus chopped wood or set traps. Each afternoon, Sophie cooked, mended, and learned the ways of the mountains, the names of herbs, the meaning of bird calls, the secret paths that deer carved through the snow. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke more clearly than any kindness she'd known. When her hands blistered from splitting logs, he wrapped them in salve without comment. When she grew restless from the walls, he took her walking through the frozen valley, steadying her when her boots slipped on ice. "Keep your eyes forward," he said once as she stumbled. "The ground's never as steady as it looks." She laughed breathlessly. "That sounds like advice for more than walking." "Maybe it is," he replied, and the look he gave her then lingered like heat, even in the cold air. On the 5th morning, the clouds broke. The forest glistened under sunlight, and for the first time since the night she was lost, Sophie felt the warmth of day on her face. Marcus stood beside her on the porch, his shadow falling over hers. "You'll heal fast now," he said, squinting toward the horizon. "Will you send me away when the road clears?" He hesitated. "You've a right to go wherever you please." "That's not what I asked." He turned to her then, and in his gaze she saw a flicker of something uncertain, unguarded. "No," he said quietly, "I won't send you away, not unless you ask me to." For a moment, neither moved. The wind lifted a strand of her hair, brushing it against his arm. He didn't pull away. Inside, the fire waited, and the world beyond the ridge gleamed with promise. But for Sophie, this, his quiet presence beside her, the safety of the mountain, was the first home she had ever truly known. Winter stretched on, but inside the small cabin, the cold lost its power. Every morning, Sophie woke to the low hum of the fire and the quiet rhythm of Marcus Ironwood moving about. Boots on the floorboards, the scrape of iron on the stove, the low whistle of a kettle. It was a music she grew to love more than any song. The cabin itself began to change under her touch. Marcus had built it for survival, efficient, spare, made only for one man. But Sophie, without realizing it, filled it with life again. She mended the curtains, patched the quilt, and carved little notches into the windowsill to mark each week that passed. A wild flower, pressed flat and delicate, found its place between 2 logs above the bed. The place began to look less like a fortress and more like a home. By mid-morning, Sophie would prepare breakfast, oatcakes or rabbit stew, depending on what Marcus brought back. He always rose before sunrise, hunting or cutting wood, and returned dusted with frost. He never spoke much when he came in, but he would nod toward her and mutter, "Smells good," before hanging his coat by the door. At first, she answered him with shy politeness, but slowly, as the days turned into weeks, the silence between them began to soften. They learned the small languages of companionship, the way she'd pour his coffee before he asked, the way he'd quietly fix anything that broke without being told. Sometimes she caught him watching her, not the way men in town had with judgment or hunger, but with the quiet curiosity of someone rediscovering what tenderness looked like. Once, as she stirred the stew, she said softly, "You're not as frightening as I thought you were." He raised a brow. "You thought I was frightening?" "You found me in the dark, covered in snow, carrying an axe." He gave a short laugh, deep and rough. "Fair point. And what do you think now?" She glanced over her shoulder, smiling shyly. "Now, I think you're the safest thing I've ever known." He didn't answer, but his expression shifted, something between gratitude and disbelief. Marcus never declared affection in words, but his kindness showed itself in the quiet ways that matter most. He built her a small stool by the fire so she could rest while cooking. He carved her a comb from elk bone when she complained that her hair tangled too easily. When her boots split, he mended them with leather cords strong enough to last a lifetime. Each gesture came with no explanation, just a nod, as if to say, "That's how it should be." One morning, when Sophie tried to carry 2 heavy logs for the stove, Marcus intercepted her halfway. "You'll hurt your back," he said, taking them easily from her arms. "I can manage," she protested. "You don't have to," he replied simply, stacking the wood himself. "Not here?" She stood for a moment, watching him, feeling something she hadn't felt in years, a deep, disarming sense of being cared for. By February, Marcus began teaching her the small skills that kept him alive up there, the difference between rabbit and fox tracks, how to find north by the moss on trees, how to light a fire even when the world was wet. When she failed to spark a flame the first few times, she muttered, "I suppose the forest just knows I'm not meant for it." He crouched beside her, taking the flint from her hands. "The forest doesn't judge. It just waits until you stop fighting it." Then he struck the flint, sending a shower of sparks into the tinder. The fire caught instantly. Sophie looked at him in awe. "How did you do that?" He smiled faintly. "Didn't fight it." The lesson stayed with her longer than the fire did. That night, the wind howled against the cabin, but inside it was warm, golden, and still. Marcus sat sharpening his knife while Sophie darned a tear in his coat. "Your stitching's better than mine," he said quietly. "Years of sewing dresses for women who never wanted me near them," she replied, smiling a little. "It feels good to mend something that belongs to someone kind." He looked up from his work. "People didn't treat you right." She shrugged. "I suppose I didn't fit their idea of what a woman should be." He set the knife down. "Their idea was wrong." Sophie froze, eyes wide. "You mean that?" "Every word." For a long while she couldn't speak. No one had ever said it so plainly. Her throat tightened, and before she could stop herself, tears filled her eyes. Marcus stood awkwardly, unsure what to do, then finally knelt beside her chair. "I didn't mean to upset you," You didn't, she whispered. It's just no one's ever said something like that to me before. He hesitated, then reached out, his hand large and warm over hers. Then they were fools. She looked at their joined hands, his scarred and rough, hers small and soft, and something in the room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like snow falling on still ground. March crept in with longer days. The snow outside began to thaw, and streams ran again, laughing under the ice. Sophie planted early seeds in small clay pots near the window, while Marcus repaired the fence behind the cabin. One afternoon, she brought him a mug of coffee where he worked. "You've been out here since dawn," she scolded lightly. "Even mountains need rest." He took the cup, smiling. "You comparing me to a mountain now?" "I think the mountain's smaller," she teased, and the way he laughed made her heart stumble. When he set the mug down, his fingers brushed hers. An accidental touch, but it lingered. His gaze met hers, something unspoken, alive between them. Neither moved for several breaths, as if the world itself were holding still. Then Marcus cleared his throat, stepping back. "Storm coming," he muttered. "Best get the animals in." But later that night, as they sat beside the fire, the silence between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like promise. Weeks later, Sophie awoke one dawn to the sound of Marcus humming softly as he chopped wood. She sat up, smiling without knowing why. The sound was low and unguarded, a song meant for no one but the morning. For the first time since the night she'd been abandoned, she realized she didn't feel broken anymore. She wasn't the girl left behind in the forest. She was part of something steady and strong, a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat. When Marcus came in, brushing snow from his shoulders, she met his eyes and said simply, "Welcome home." He froze, looking at her as if the words had struck deep. Then he smiled, a slow, quiet smile that belonged only to her. "Yeah," he said softly, "home." The thaw came slowly that year. By April, the snow retreated to the high ridges, leaving behind a world soaked in mud and new life. Meltwater whispered through the trees, and sunlight spilled into the valley for the first time in months. Inside the cabin, Sophie hung the windows open and let the scent of pine and wet earth flood in. The fire burned smaller now, no longer a matter of survival, but of comfort. It should have been peace. Yet beneath the quiet, both she and Marcus knew something was changing, something neither dared name. One morning, Marcus rode down to the trading post for supplies, promising to return by sundown. When he was gone, Sophie began tidying the small table by the bed. There, tucked beneath a folded map, she found an envelope, worn, creased, the ink faded with years. The writing on it was delicate, a woman's hand. "My dearest Marcus, if this reaches you, it means the fire took more than we ever imagined. If God is merciful, He will let you forgive yourself. I loved you for the man you tried to be, not the one you feared you were. Clara." Sophie's hand shook as she read the name. Clara, the wife he had lost. She folded the letter back, heart pounding. She'd known Marcus carried sorrow, but now she could feel it breathing in the walls, in the cracks of the wood, in the weight of every silence they'd shared. When he returned that evening, she tried to act normal, pouring coffee, asking about the road, but Marcus noticed the tightness in her voice. "You found it, didn't you?" he asked quietly. Sophie froze. "The letter?" He nodded, removing his glove slowly. "You don't have to explain. I shouldn't have left it out." She hesitated. I wasn't trying to pry. I know, he said. You're too kind for that. For a long moment, they stood facing each other, the past hovering like smoke between them. Clara was... He swallowed hard. She was light. I wasn't ready to lose her. When she and the boys died, I came up here to keep from losing my mind. Sophie's voice trembled. And now? Do you still think you're alone? Marcus looked at her with eyes that seemed to carry every winter he'd lived through. Until you came, I thought I'd earned it. That loneliness was the price for failing to protect them. She stepped forward. You didn't fail them. You survived for them. You saved me, Marcus. You still know how to protect. He almost smiled, but it was the kind that hurt more than it healed. You shouldn't waste your heart on a man who's half ghost. Sophie lifted her chin. Maybe I was never afraid of ghosts. Maybe I just needed one to see me. He turned away, pacing toward the door. You don't understand what you're saying. But she did. And for the first time, she refused to be the one left behind. The next week, the world came knocking. 3 riders arrived at the edge of the clearing, rough men, one wearing a familiar black hat. Sophie saw them first through the window. Her blood ran cold. "Marcus!" she called. He came to her side, hand already reaching for the rifle. "Bandits. The ones who robbed the stage," she whispered. "I'd know that man anywhere." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Stay inside." He stepped out onto the porch, the door swinging open behind him. The man in the black hat grinned. "Heard tell you're keeping a little bird up here, Ironwood, one who got away from us." Marcus's voice was calm, measured. "You heard wrong." The man laughed. "She's worth something, you know. The sheriff's been asking. Says her would-be groom's offering a reward for her return. $500. That's enough to make a man forget his manners." "Then you'll have to find another man," Marcus said, cocking his rifle. The bandit's smile faded. "Careful, mountain man. I don't miss twice." "Neither do I." The standoff stretched like a taut rope. Then, perhaps sensing the unshakable in Marcus's stance, the bandits cursed under their breath and turned back toward the trail. When he came inside, Sophie was shaking. "They know I'm here," she whispered. "They'll tell others." Marcus set the rifle down, his face unreadable. "Let them. If they come again, they'll find I don't take kindly to trespassers." But the visit changed something. The air between them grew heavy with unspoken fear. Sophie began to worry she'd brought danger into his life, that her presence would cost him more than solitude ever had. Marcus grew quieter, retreating behind the walls he'd spent years building. One evening, as they sat in the flickering light, she whispered, "Maybe I should leave when the road's clear." He looked up sharply. "Leave? Why?" "You've already lost too much. I don't want to be the reason you lose more." Marcus stood, frustration darkening his features. "You think I saved you just to send you back into the world that left you for dead? I think you deserve peace." He stepped closer, his voice low. "Peace doesn't come from being alone, Sophie. It comes from finding something worth fighting for." Her eyes glistened. "And am I worth that?" He stopped. The question hit like thunder. For a moment, neither moved. Then he reached out, fingers trembling slightly, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You already are." That night, the wind rose again, fierce and howling through the pines. Marcus stoked the fire, but it refused to chase away the dread that hung in the air. Somewhere beyond the ridge, wolves cried, and beneath their voices the faint echo of hooves. "They've come back," Marcus said, his tone flat and certain. Sophie's heart lurched. "What do we do?" He checked the chamber of his rifle. "We stand our ground." "Together?" He looked at her, fearless, fragile, unyielding, and nodded once. "Together." She reached for his arm. "Marcus, if something happens to you—" He caught her hand, pressing it against his chest. "Then you'll keep the fire burning." Before she could speak, the first gunshot shattered the night. The first bullet shattered the window, scattering glass across the floor like a spray of ice. Sophie screamed and ducked behind the table, heart pounding. Outside, the roar of hooves and rough voices filled the night. Marcus was already moving. He kicked the fire higher, loading his rifle with steady hands. His voice stayed calm, low enough for her alone to hear. "Stay behind the stove. Keep low. If anyone comes through that door, you don't hesitate. Shoot." Sophie nodded, trembling, clutching the smaller pistol he had pressed into her hands days ago. Outside, a voice shouted through the storm. "Ironwood, we know she's in there. Hand her over and we'll let you live." Marcus stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, the firelight behind him casting his shadow long and wide. "You can try," he called back, "but you'll have to walk through hell to get her." The bandits answered with gunfire. Bullets tore into the cabin's logs, thudding like fists against bone. Marcus dropped to one knee and fired, one shot, two, clean, measured. A scream rose from the darkness, followed by a curse. Sophie pressed her back against the wall, shaking. She could hear the fury in their voices, the crunch of boots in snow. They were circling, trying to flank the cabin. Marcus burst back through the door, his coat soaked and smoking from the muzzle flash. "They're spreading out," he said, reloading. "We hold them here. Window's weak. Keep an eye on it." She swallowed hard. "Marcus, I'm scared." He turned to her, his expression softening for just a heartbeat. "Good. Fear keeps you alive, but don't let it rule you. Breathe, Sophie. You're stronger than you think." Another crash. The back door splintered open. A man stumbled inside, a knife flashing in his hand. Sophie froze for half a second, then fired. The recoil nearly knocked her backward, but the man fell hard, the knife clattering beside him. Marcus whirled at the sound, saw the body, and met her eyes. "You did what you had to." The remaining attackers hesitated after that, but their leader, the man in the black hat, bellowed, "Burn them out! Burn the place down!" Through the window, Sophie saw the flicker of fire, torches. Smoke began to seep through the gaps in the logs. Marcus grabbed the bucket by the stove, dousing the floor near the door. "Get the blankets wet," he shouted. "We can smother it before it catches." Sophie obeyed, moving with desperate speed. The flames licked at the porch, but Marcus kicked the door open, tossing snow and water until the fire hissed and died. Then he charged into the yard, swinging the rifle like a club, slamming it into the nearest man. Gunfire cracked again, the night flashing bright. Sophie couldn't see him through the smoke, only the sound of his growl, the dull thud of fists meeting flesh. Then silence. When Marcus finally staggered back inside, blood streaked his cheek, his breath ragged. "It's done," he said, shutting the door behind him. "They won't be coming back." Sophie dropped the pistol and ran to him. "You're hurt." "Not bad," he murmured, catching her as her knees gave way. "You did good, Sophie." She pressed her face against his chest, sobbing with relief. "I thought I'd lose you." He lifted her chin, his thumb tracing away the tears. You almost did, and I couldn't let that happen." Their faces were inches apart. Outside, the wind died, and the silence that followed was soft, almost holy. "Why?" she whispered. He smiled faintly. "Because you're the reason I started living again." Then he kissed her, slow, fierce, full of everything they had survived. Her hands gripped his coat, his arms wrapped around her, anchoring her as the world finally stilled. When they broke apart, the first light of dawn was creeping over the snow, painting the cabin gold. "It's over," he said, voice rough but sure. Sophie nodded, tears glimmering like dew. "No," she whispered, "it's just beginning." By the time the sun climbed above the ridge, the forest was quiet again. Smoke curled lazily from the rifle barrels stacked by the door. The bandits were gone. 2 dead in the snow, the rest fled into the trees with the dawn. Sophie stood on the porch wrapped in Marcus's coat, watching the light spill across the valley. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and ash. Behind her, the cabin still smoldered faintly where bullets had scarred the walls. Yet, for the first time in her life, she felt safe. Marcus came up beside her, his limp slight but steady. His hands were bandaged, his face lined with exhaustion and relief. "They won't come back," he said quietly, "not after what they saw." Sophie turned to him, eyes bright. "You should rest. You haven't slept?" He shook his head. "Not yet. I need to make sure the traps are reset. If we're staying, we'll need food." The word we caught her breath. She looked down at her hands, remembering how they had once trembled in fear. Now they only trembled when he was near. "Marcus," she whispered, "you don't have to stay here because of me." He frowned. "You think I'd keep you here out of pity?" "I think," her voice faltered, "I think you built this place to forget, and I don't want to be another ghost in your memory." He stepped closer, tilting her chin until her eyes met his. "You're not a ghost, Sophie. You're the first thing in 10 years that feels real." Her breath caught. "And you're the first man who's ever looked at me and seen a woman, not a burden." He smiled faintly. "That's because you're not a burden. You're the reason this place finally feels like home again." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind carried the sound of melting snow dripping from the roof, like slow applause from the mountains themselves. Inside, the fire popped, steady and alive. Sophie looked toward it, then back at him. So what now? Marcus turned his gaze to the distant peaks, where sunlight glowed on the snowcaps. "We rebuild. We plant come spring. Maybe someday we'll ride into town again, see if the world still remembers us. And if it doesn't," he looked at her and smiled, "then we'll remind it." She laughed softly through her tears. "You make it sound so simple." "It is," he said, reaching for her hand, "as long as you're here." She slipped her fingers into his, their palms fitting like something inevitable. The forest whispered around them, not threatening now, but welcoming. As the sun climbed higher, Sophie leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice barely more than a sigh. "You're safe here," Marcus murmured, echoing the promise he'd made the first night she woke in his bed. "It's your home now, if you'll have it." Her answer came as a whisper carried on the wind. "I already do." And outside their small cabin on the edge of the world, 2 souls once lost to cold and fear stood in the light, ready to face whatever came next, together. Every time I tell stories like Sophie and Marcus's, I'm reminded that love doesn't arrive in perfection. It arrives in survival, in kindness, in the quiet choice to stay. Wherever you're listening from, maybe a crowded city, maybe a small village, maybe somewhere the snow still falls, I hope you remember this. Even in the coldest winter, someone out there is keeping the fire for you. If this story reached your heart, tell me where you're listening from in the comments below. And don't go far. The next story will prove that even the broken can find home again.